Senator Day.
Thank you, Madam Acting Deputy President. Every teenager, every family, every business, every government in the world that gets into financial difficulty says the same thing. If I could just get a little bit more income, I'd be fine. Well, I'm sorry to break the news, but it never works. When you're in financial difficulty, when your spending exceeds your income, the only solution is to shrink to viability and then regrow from there. Now, first let me say from the outset that I understand the government's predicament. I have been in the government's position. I have experienced industry slumps where the market drops by something like 40%, leading to a 40% drop in revenue. It is painful. It's disruptive. The structures, the systems, the staffing and the resources that have been put in place to handle X level of activity are suddenly confronted with the chill winds of economic reality. The government is experiencing what thousands of business owners experience. Welcome to their world. Madam Acting Deputy President, employment levels are falling. Our terms of trade are falling. Home ownership levels are falling. While at the same time our national debt is rising, interest payments on our debt are rising, government spending in a whole range of areas is also rising. Something has to give. Not only that, pretty soon a person on average ordinary full-time earnings will move into the country's second highest tax bracket. With 5 levels in our tax system, the idea that someone on average weekly earnings would be on the second highest tax bracket should give serious pause for thought. High tax rates undermine enterprise and destroy the will to work. The prospect of giving up nearly half your earnings leads people to decide that it is simply not worth it. Taxation at these levels starts to produce gross inefficiencies as people stop working as much or as hard as they have been, and governments find their taxes are not producing the revenue they expected. Similarly, many on welfare benefits decline opportunities to work because of the punitive effect small earnings and high tax rates have on the security of their welfare benefits and the value of extra work. People on very low incomes fare worst of all, for as they increase their earnings, higher rates of income tax combine with the loss of means-tested benefits which deprive them of up to 80 cents of every extra dollar they earn. If we are to extricate ourselves from this dysfunctional system, the goodwill of the public needs to be restored by getting tax levels back to something which most people would see as reasonable. Australia will get nowhere with tax rates like these. Bosses aren't ripping off workers, it's the government that's ripping off workers. Senator Lyon-Helm and I have moved this motion today out of concern that when it comes to getting the budget in order, when it comes to relieving the tax burden on Australian families, the government seems to adopt the teenagers' plea for more money rather than reducing its spending. The Australian government is simply too big and has for too long been captive of the discredited Keynesian theory of economics, where governments are looked to for so-called economic leadership to stimulate the economy by injecting money into it. And far from solving the nation's economic problems, they just make them worse. This is because, simply put, governments, that is, politicians and government bureaucrats who make the decisions on these things, do not know enough to make the right decisions. If they did, like Bert Kelly once said, they wouldn't be here in Canberra, they'd be sitting in the south of France with their feet in a bucket of champagne. Now, this applies to everything from trying to solve an alleged global problem with carbon dioxide emissions to the most minuscule local issues that neighbours or communities could very easily sort out themselves. My home state of South Australia is a classic example of failed Keynesian thinking. The state government there thinks it can spend its way out of an economic slump. It has gambled South Australian taxpayers' money and lost it, and all South Australia has to show for it is record debt and record deficit. But as always, Keynesians never ever admit they're wrong. They're like the gambler who goes to the racetrack or casino thinking if he keeps doubling his bet each time, eventually he'll back a winner and get all his money back. And all that happens is he runs out of money. And there is nothing more certain than the South Australian state government will run out of money. I co-sponsored this motion today because I started to think very carefully about this topic when the Prime Minister urged the crossbench to think of savings measures if we were inclined to oppose other government measures. At the time the Prime Minister first made that request, I pointed out 3 easy savings areas. The first is a measure that you heard me outline in my first speech in this place, and I will keep saying it until I'm blue in the face, and perhaps even after that. And that is allow people to escape from the industrial regulation prison. It gets them off the dole and will improve the budget position by billions of dollars. For every 1% of people who get off the dole, the government saves $100 million. We spend $145 billion, more than a third of the budget, on social security and welfare, and that will grow over the next 3 years to $169 billion, or 33% of the budget, subject to what has passed or might pass the Senate since July. We pay these benefits to a cohort of people who could otherwise be working and be financially independent.